Hi, I'm Nicola, and I like to think that I have been teaching for a very long time, because when I was in primary school I used to gather the children in the street, allocate them the role of students and me the role of teacher, and like it or not, we were playing schools. So that's a very long history of being bossy. Later, when I left school, I was trying to decide between science and education. I ended up doing a science degree first, followed by a graduate diploma of education in primary. So I guess when I developed a practice process in the classroom and I found that it was working really well, it was my science side that thought, I wonder why it's working so well and I wonder if it can be improved. And that's what led to me completing a research master's, which I finished last year. So I'm hoping that in reviewing the research today, that you will leave this training with some ideas about how to implement some of the theory that I'll share with you, and also a practical, manageable and evidence-informed process which you can use to support your classroom instruction through student practice. Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation. Just letting you know, this is the 100-minute symposium. I will be stopping for breaks for you to reflect and maybe ask questions, which may have to come through an email. But I also have another presentation, 45-minute presentation on effective and efficient student practice strategies for educators and therapists. If you're a teacher, the process I'm about to describe is quite helpful for individual education plans. If you'd like to do some training on that, there is a free presentation on my website. And if you are looking to share this process in a very quick way, then I would recommend you take a look at the parent resources on my website. You'll see these slides coming up. It will be wonderful if you have an email open that you can jot down your reflections and also any questions and send them through to me. I would be delighted to receive them and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. This presentation is going to start with some background information, both in my classroom experience and also with the masters. Then I'm going to go on to describe the new theoretical understandings that I discovered and their applications to the practice process. I'll then finish with a demonstration of the full revised process. So when I first taught a kindy and pre-primary class, I'd come out of the primary extension and challenge program. So it was quite a big shift. These students were using the well-researched Jolly Phonics program, and I followed the pre-primary students into year one. There were two problems that I noticed after that 6 weeks Christmas break. First of all, there'd been quite a diversity in the forgetting of their phonics sounds, and also that there were several students who needed a lot more practice time than the rest. These are differentiation issues and all teachers face these all of the time. My second issue was trying to get my new year ones to have instant recall of their number bonds to 10. So we did lots of activities, games, software, worksheets, speed partitioning, all types of things to get them to have instant recall. So all the indicators were great when I was speaking to students individually, when we were having instruction time on the mat. It seemed to me that virtually everyone could tell me those number bonds to 10. However, at an end of term test, about 4 weeks later, less than 30% of the class could recall all of those number bonds to 10. So the problem with differentiation and the problem with consolidation really got me thinking about long-term memory. And Why weren't the students remembering, and how could I help them to have this instant recall that I was looking for? So within your teaching context, what challenges have you experienced with differentiation and consolidation? Feel free to pause the video to give yourself time to reflect and maybe jot down some notes. The tool that you see here was commonplace in Western Australia a few decades before I started trying to work on this process. I'd never been taught how to use a mastery learning folder, though I knew that the content, which was in flashcard format, was moved forward when correct or returned to the same pocket if incorrect. And it was frequently used to assist students to memorise their sound symbol relationships. So I set about giving them a go to try to help me to address the differentiation and consolidation needs. The way that I implemented them was that I had parent helpers coming to the classroom when they dropped off their child, and they would conduct the 5 to 10 minute daily practice session at that time, and I conducted the mastery test once a week on the learning items that had reached the test pocket. After 3 years of informal action research, I was happy with the process and the results exceeded my expectations. Not only did the folder differentiate the content, the process differentiated the learning time as well, and no learning item graduated from the folder until it had been mastered. So I then began using it cross-curricular, using assessments and also just over-the-shoulder marking to identify relevant content. Because the folders needed to be remade, I ended up, after those few years, creating a hardcover mastery learning folder tool that you see here. Over the years, the content in the folder became quite diverse. The focus was on the remembering, understanding and applying levels of Bloom's taxonomy, but it contained facts, strategies and tasks. And in more recent times, the folders have even included things like social skills and personal goals. So what thoughts come to your mind when you see the tool and the potential learning content? In volunteer teacher training experiences, I began starting to share the process, and in doing so, I realised that apart from my understandings of Bloom's taxonomy and mastery learning, I had no idea why the process was working. This was when my science background kicked in and I wanted to know why. I also realised that if I understood the theoretical foundation, I may be able to improve the process. In 2017, I commenced a Masters of Education by Research, and the research questions were, what is the theoretical foundation of the process? And what's best practice in applying this theory? And does the process need to be maintained or modified? My theoretical perspective was pragmatism and realism within a cognitivist theoretical framework. My research design caused me an enormous amount of stress. For 2.5 years, this was me trying to find the best research design. Thankfully, finally, I discovered realist synthesis, which reflected what I had been doing up until that time. Realist synthesis seeks to understand the mechanisms at work in an intervention and also in the process, exploring how they work and under what conditions for improved implementation. First of all, I needed to describe the intervention and process, then identify and categorise the theories, appraise the research evidence, then synthesise and apply this theory to the process, determining if it needed to be modified or maintained. Realist synthesis values expert framing in the pursuit of improving interventions. So in this case, that would be me. Bias is tempered through having a theoretical foundation and a systematized, transparent review process. Here's the structure of the thesis. The development of an intervention logic map really helped to lay the foundation of the research process. So you can see that the intervention is based on classroom instruction. However, there was a lack of manageable process to be able to consolidate student learning to the level of the individual. So this created teacher management challenges. These three could be described as the failure of all students to achieve learning automaticity, the perception of insufficient time during lessons, and a perceived lack of support to fulfill this goal. So first of all, a failure of students to achieve learning automaticity is based on the need to address their individual needs and their prior knowledge. So I needed to know where to start the process of assisting them to consolidate learning from their point of need. So that included learning progressions, assessments of classroom learning, and all of this would be benefited by a differentiated mastery learning process. So they were only proceeding through to the next level of their learning after they had mastered it. The second problem was an insufficient time during lessons. So what I wanted to do was to circumvent this time pressure of lessons and think about, was there time outside of the lesson context that these issues could be addressed? And of course, the presence of a tool was very helpful because the volunteers could be trained in how to use it separately. And then I considered, what times do I have available, particularly times where I could perhaps get some volunteer support. And that was at classroom drop-off time or pick-up time, and also for homework. Finally, this lack of support needed to be addressed. I considered that this support would be in the form of tutors, and the tutors that I found were parents or older siblings if the process was to be used for homework, education assistants, and a source that I hadn't considered before was student leaders. Most primary schools, which is the context that I was thinking about, do have student leaders who are looking for jobs to do, and those student leaders could come down before the school bell in the morning and assist with parents, volunteer parent helpers. These tutors then provided individualised one-on-one feedback and instruction, and the content was fairly simple. So all of these things led into an instructional process. Now, my understandings prior to research, my theoretical understandings, were of Bloom's revised taxonomy and the idea that content that has been remembered can then be understood and applied, and also mastery learning, where students don't actually proceed forward until they've mastered the appropriate content for their prior knowledge. The outcomes that I observed were individualised progress, the differentiation was manageable, the learning consolidation was manageable, and I saw that students did develop learning automaticity for the content at their level. Two of the surprising factors that I hadn't anticipated was an increase in student and teacher motivation and also self-efficacy. And this was a real bonus. The students began to realise that learning was a process and that errors were a part of that process. And it was very motivating to them and they enjoyed participating. So now I'd like to talk you through the original practice process as it was when I started my research in 2017. So here you can see the original pocket labels. The pockets that are green represent the pockets used by the tutors, by the volunteers, and those sessions occurred during the week. The blue pockets, these two here, represent the mastery testing stage once a week, and the teacher was also responsible for the learning content in the store pocket. So the store pocket is actually an inactive pocket. It's not containing content that is included in the process. So this pocket can be topped up at any time, and then an amount of flashcards selected by the teacher is transferred into the first active pocket. In this case, I've just selected 7 random flashcards. The tutor testing commences from the start pocket. However, if there's no content in that pocket, then they move backwards through the pockets till they find the pocket that has content. Probably the most counterintuitive part of the process is that the testing proceeds backwards through the pockets. The content, when correct, moves forward, or at the time of this process, the content that was incorrect would be returned to the hive. So here's some examples of classroom practice sessions, often determined by what is going on in the classroom on a particular day. For example, if the practice testing with tutors is occurring before the school bell, in my classroom, Wednesday was assembly day and there simply wasn't time for that to occur. So 4 sessions a week was what I did during that period of time. But there can be 5 sessions a week or 3 sessions a week. And generally, the more sessions, the easier the process is. So junior primary is likely to have more sessions. As I've described, the mastery test occurs once during the week, and this is normally conducted by the teacher. So this could be on the same day as a tutor testing session, possibly at the same time if the students are occupied with their tutor testing, or at a different time. Alternatively, it could be on a day that's different to the tutor testing days, perhaps during a session when the teacher has more time and the students are working more independently. I often did my mastery testing during library periods because the librarian was reading the students a story. Alternatively, some teachers may prefer to stagger the testing with different students across the week. So a particular student would always be tested on Monday, but the teacher would be testing, say, 5 students a day. And both the tutor testing and the mastery test are quite quick, around about 5 to 10 minutes for the tutor testing and less than a few minutes for the teacher test. The process for both tutor testing and mastery testing is the same. The first thing to happen is always the test, because this is testing the recall over the previous interval. And step 2 is to check for understanding, provide feedback and instruction. Here we have the folder ready to go for the very first session, given there's only content in the first pocket. So the tutor will test the content in this pocket and it will move forward if correct, and it will be placed aside if it's not correct. And that was step 1. The content that was not correct is returned to the hive. And then step 2 is to check for understanding and revise. You'll notice here that the content is mixed. Very quickly in the development of the process, I started adding in anything that I noticed from students in the classroom that needed work. So now we're on to the next session. So if the sessions were each day and the previous one was on Monday, this would be the Tuesday session. And the tutor always begins from the pocket that has the content that's furthest along. Items that are correct are moved forward, items that are not are placed aside. So for this one, the tutor was looking that the student was holding their pencil correctly. And this is a subitizing question which was recognised, a spelling word that was correctly written down. This is a mental math strategy, and the student could demonstrate an efficient way to mentally add those numbers. And that one was also correct. So the 2 flashcards that were set aside were not correct, and they are returning back to the hive. So in returning back to the hive, the learning time was differentiated. It also gave teachers and tutors the opportunity to talk about the learning process and to help them to see that with content returning to the hive, it was just providing them with more time to learn those items. So now I've skipped forward to a later session. We now have learning items throughout the tutor testing phase, and we are beginning from the start pocket and working backwards. Whenever there is content in this pocket, that's where we begin. As I've described, this is the tutor section occurring during the week, and this is the mastery testing stage that occurs once a week. This flashcard tests correctly. It moves out of the tutor stage and into the mastery test stage. So in order to keep the learning load the same, at this time, a new flashcard from the store pocket was placed aside, and that will come into the process when the testing is finished. So that spelling word was written down correctly. Those sounds could be described. The times table fact was correct, as was the pencil grip. The strategy for adding those numbers together was not what the teacher was looking for. So those 2 flashcards go back to the hive and the learning load is maintained. The tutor then checks for understanding and revises. So now we come to the teacher mastery test, which is once a week. I'd just like to describe the process that happens in these 2 pockets. So that flashcard was demonstrated, as was this one. However, that subitizing flashcard was not correct, and so it was returned to the store pocket. And the reason for that is that the process at this time wanted to maintain the learning load, and if that came into the hive, then it would increase the number of flashcards, which may not be desired. So in going back to the store, the learning load is maintained. This is also a great time for the teacher to add new learning content to the store pocket. And the beauty of the process is that even if the teacher is unable to conduct a mastery test one week for whatever reason, the tutors can continue with the tutor testing stage as long as there is always content in that store pocket. So they won't actually be held up. I developed a diagrammatic representation of the process to help me in discussions of modifications and maintenance to the process. So here you can see that the process is based on classroom instruction. There will of course be lesson-based practice, And then the new practice process provides the opportunity to drill down to the level of the individual. Don't worry about DLCP, that was Differentiated Learning Consolidation Process, which was the name I used in my thesis for the process. So the process enables the use of differentiated learning content, and they are placed into the store pocket. Approximately 3 to 20 flashcards, the learning load, are then placed into the hive. Then there's a self-paced process where content moves forward when correct, but when incorrect, it returns back to the hive. The starting point is wherever the content is furthest along. If the folder tutor pockets are fully populated, then this is the starting pocket and the testing proceeds backwards. In order to move on to the mastery test phase, there needs to be 5 consecutive correct responses. And if that has occurred, then the flashcard, the learning item, goes into the test pocket where it sits between 1 and 7 days, depending on which day it arrives there before the mastery test pocket. It's tested, and if it's correct, it goes into the mastered pocket. If it's not correct, then it goes all the way back to the store pocket so that this learning load is not disrupted. So do you have any thoughts on the original practice process? I would love to hear them, or I would love to hear your questions and respond to them via email. I'd now like to take a look at some of the new theoretical understandings that I've gained through looking into the foundation of the Mastery Learning Folder process. There was a huge range of theories from macro down to micro, and it was a mammoth undertaking. Dr. John Hattie was one of my examiners, and he said, "The literature review is huge," and I wondered how the student would interact with this, and it sure did take the reader into these depths. Well, unfortunately, I can't take you into these depths, so I really can only share those insights that I found most interesting and directly relevant to the process. The understanding that current performance can be a highly unreliable index of whether learning has occurred fundamentally changed my beliefs about teaching. This concept took me right back to that experience in teaching Friends of 10. During instruction, the students were all very fluent in giving me those number bond combinations. However, at a delayed test a few weeks later, less than 30% of the class had that instant recall. I asked myself, why was this so? And how often have I overestimated what students have retained? Basically, it boils down to a forgetting problem. More than 100 years ago, Hermann Ebbinghause conducted a memory experiment using the memorization of nonsense syllables. He learnt them, he tested himself, and he documented how many he could remember over a period of time. And this resulted in what we now know as the forgetting curve. This phenomenon is why Kirschner, Sweller, and Clark state that if nothing has changed in long-term memory, nothing has been learned. So I discovered that it's not enough just to expose students to learning or have them participate, or even for them to understand the learning. Whilst these things are important, they don't necessarily guarantee the movement of learning into long-term memory. So this information had a major impact on my thoughts about teaching and learning, and I'm wondering, how do you respond to them? So we know that we can learn some things implicitly. Geary's evolutionary psychology theory sheds some light here. Biologically primary knowledge we can acquire implicitly through participation in society. Things like listening, speaking, and generic problem solving, which relates well to a lot of early childhood play-based learning. Biologically secondary knowledge, however, is culturally relevant. It's subject-specific and it's learned through instruction and learning effort. So, for example, students need instruction in order to link phonic sounds with their symbols. Older students need instruction and practice to become proficient in using quadratic equations. So the mastery learning folder process is related to biologically secondary knowledge. I'd like to ask you to participate in an investigation using your own memory. So what we have here is 17 numbers in a row. I'd like you to see how many of these numbers you can remember when I take the numbers away. So I'll give you a moment to take a look at them. And now I'd like you to write them down. So, how did you go? Well, Miller says there's a magical number of 7 that we can remember. However, that's plus or minus 2, and it doesn't really relate to when there's processing involved. Other theorists think that that we can remember a lot fewer than that. So I'm going to try the same investigation with you, but this time I'm going to see how many of these 17 letters you can remember. I'm fairly sure that you don't need to write that down because I know that you could remember them. So what is the difference? Well, we can remember the whole of that sentence as a chunk because we understand what words are, we know the sound symbol relationships of the letters, we understand what a sentence is. We know the meanings of the word cat, sat, and mat, and the phrase is familiar to us. So why is this the case? Well, working memory limitations are reduced through the ability to transfer domain-specific secondary knowledge in chunks from long-term memory into our working memory. So when we have knowledge secure in long-term memory, it means that there's space in our limited working memory for processing information. So things like reasoning and higher order thinking skills. But note again, reasoning is based on domain-specific knowledge. An ability to think critically about chess does not translate into an ability to think critically about sailing. So where does that leave us in terms of 21st century learning that we've been hearing so much about over the years? Data from the last 30 years lead to a conclusion that is not scientifically challengeable. Thinking well, reasoning, requires knowing facts. So, what are your thoughts on the acquisition and value of knowledge? So how do we facilitate durable knowledge for our students? Erickson and Poole researched the habits and practices of exceptional performers across a variety of fields. They identified a set of general principles, which they collectively termed deliberate practice. The folder process is focused, purposeful, and systematic. So the next question became, what type of practice does it actually use? Some teachers presumed that it used rote learning. However, rote learning is described as mindless repetition of non-contextual learning content. For example, teaching the times tables to a 5-year-old. Classroom learning is the context for mastery learning folders. With further investigation, I discovered the new theory of disuse, commonly referred to as the desirable difficulties framework, and developed by Dr. Robert Bjork. Desirable difficulty learning strategies are characterised by certain conditions which increase the storage strength of the content being learnt. To my surprise, I realised that the folder process incorporated the desirable difficulty learning strategies of spaced practice, retrieval practice, and interleave practice. Spaced practice distributes practice over time. Retrieval practice practices the recall of learning, and interleaved practice mixes up practice questions. Dr. Daniel Willingham describes how these strategies increase the storage strength of learning. If you repeat the same thought-demanding task again and again, the brain seeks to remember it to avoid this thinking effort. So it turns out that our brains do not like trying to remember, and you may be able to relate. Our body is designed to respond to the environment. So when we feel cold, we shiver. And when we exert our muscles over time, they build in response. Well, our brain doesn't like thinking. So effortful remembering triggers an increase in the storage strength of what we're trying to remember. It's kind of like a memory hack. Spaced retrieval and interleave practice facilitate effortful remembering. I'd like to take a closer look at spaced retrieval and interleave practice. Dr. Robert Bjork describes spaced practice as perhaps the most robust effect from experimental psychology across the 130 years of research in human learning and memory. So spaced study is compared with blocked study. Blocked study could be cramming before an exam or studying the one maths topic for a week, for example. When study is conducted in this way, it makes the learning feel fluent and understood. When study or practice is separated and distributed across time, however, it's more difficult because some forgetting occurs in between those sessions. So that facilitates effortful remembering, and it's that effort that creates more durable learning. So I understood formative testing to inform learning, and I understood summative testing. But the idea that testing is actually a learning strategy was completely new to me. So in the original process, I considered that testing was just one way to determine if the content had been mastered and if it should move forward. But the testing in itself is retrieval practice, and it is a learning strategy. So how does retrieval testing actually increase desirable difficulty? Well, retrieval testing is often compared with study activities such as rereading and highlighting. When these strategies are used, the learning feels fluent. The student feels that they understand the content. However, that doesn't guarantee that they're actually remembering it. When students self-test or when tutors test students in the mastery learning folder process, it's a much more effortful experience. Students have to think and try to recall, and it's that extra effort that creates more durable learning. These memory effects are greatly enhanced when retrieval is joined with spacing. It's called spaced retrieval practice. And Dunlosky, a well-known researcher in the cognitive psychology field, says that in using spaced retrieval practice, many students will begin to master material they never thought they could learn. The final strategy is interleaved maths practice. Maths textbooks and often instruction have traditionally been delivered in blocked presentation, providing practice examples of the same type. This is good to establish a solution procedure. However, there is more that needs to be practiced. Students also need to recognise the problem type and know which strategy, which solution strategy to choose. Interleave practice mixes up practice examples from different topics or within a topic. In the mixed condition, students must recognise the type of question and also remember the solution procedure. This reflects what they will need to do in real-world situations and also in exams. A point to note, Rower and Taylor showed that when a test was delivered during practice, as in the example that you can see, the blocked condition achieved better results. However, at a delayed test, the interleaved practice condition won out 3-1. This was because the interleaved condition transfers learning to long-term memory more effectively, as both the strategy needs to be chosen and the procedure. The research evidence for maths interleaving is strong, but at this stage, there's not a lot of research on the interleaving of other subject areas. So applications of interleaving to the Mastery Learning Folder process have been limited to mathematics. Can you see any applications of desirable difficulty strategies that are relevant to your teaching and learning program? I've shared with you some of the highlights of the theories that I discovered in seeking to find the theoretical foundation of the process. I'd now like to show you my theoretical model. It's arranged starting with the broadest theories and moving inwards to the more specific theories. I'd now like to walk through some of the applications of these theories to the folder process. My application of theory was focused on spaced, interleaved and retrieval practice, as well as the development of metacognitive skills. This phase involved searching for quantitative studies, the results of which would be applied to the process that would be either maintained or modified. I'd like to highlight that studies with younger students were prioritised, however, most studies were conducted with adult populations. The impact of age on memory factors within these investigations is unknown. It is my hope, however, that the Mastery Learning Folder tool may become an instrument that's used to investigate these factors in younger populations. The tutor stage of the process is delineated by the green pockets, as you know. And to recap, here is a repeat of the tutor phase diagram. As I work my way through the applications to the process, please jot down any questions or comments. The original process predominantly addressed the remembering, understanding and applying learning objectives. However, a study by Gluckman et al. Identified that spaced practice enhances higher order thinking, such as generalizations. Whilst the use of more complex learning objectives are possible within the folder process and for independent users, The focus on lower order thinking skills has been maintained, as student leaders and parent tutors may not have access to the variety of learning objectives which need to be combined to assess this generalised learning. Pike and Rawson sought to further explore the characteristics of desirable difficulty. Their investigation revealed that difficult but successful retrievals are better for memory than easier successful retrievals. They found that multiple repetitions of learning items reduce the desirable difficulty and therefore the durability of learning. The number of potential repetitions within the original process was very high because each time a flashcard tested incorrectly, it was returned to the hive, which was the start of the process. Pike and Rawson's work suggests that these conditions may reduce desirable difficulty and also learning efficiency. The process was modified so that incorrect flashcards returned to the pocket of origin rather than the hive, which greatly reduced the unnecessary repetitions. So in the revised process, the hive was removed and replaced by a simple test pocket. 5 correct consecutive responses were replaced by 3 cumulative correct responses. Pike and Rawson used the same research design to investigate the time taken for students to retrieve an answer. Logically, response time was proven to be a good indicator of difficulty. The question considered in the original process was, is this learning item mastered or not? And the response time given was very short. Given that difficult but successful retrievals are better for learning, the response time provided was extended from a few seconds to around 10 seconds to allow students to experience that thinking struggle. So there is now the understanding that in the mastery learning folder process, every retrieval is a test of mastery and a learning event. Rawson and Dunlosky investigated a scenario where, for example, a student needed to pass a test within a course and also maintain the necessary prior knowledge for a subsequent, more advanced course. They asked what type of practice schedule would be the most efficient and effective for passing both tests. They identified that 3 successful recalls was optimally efficient to recall learning in the short term, for example, for a forthcoming test. Only minor gains were achieved by increasing the number of recalls. After this initial criterion was met, learning durability was enhanced by 3 subsequent longer spaced retrievals. Likewise, a greater number of sessions resulted in decreasing learning gains and so reduced efficiency. This practice schedule was incorporated into the process. 3 spaced retrievals over days was instigated to reach an initial criterion of learning, followed by 3 wider spaced retrievals to improve retention over a longer delay. The discussion will now continue relating the process to the Criterion phase. Originally, I considered that the learning load was related to difficulty. This is the number of active flashcards in the process. So high aptitude students would receive more flashcards than lower aptitude students. But Pike and Rawson's study demonstrated that desirable difficulty is achieved when retrievals are effortful and successful. So the number of flashcards is irrelevant to difficulty. Difficulty is related to the appropriate content for each student and also the desirable difficulty strategies. The learning load is, however, related to the length of the folder session. So if the session is too long, the number of flashcards can be reduced and vice versa. A learning load of around 20 flashcards should result in a session of between 5 and 10 minutes, which is quite practical in the classroom. Pike and Rawson's study demonstrated that the optimum interstudy interval is a successful retrieval at the longest possible interval duration. Mettler et al. Compared adaptive spacing with fixed spacing, and adaptive spacing resulted in less forgetting than the fixed conditions. Moving flashcards forward when correct and returning them to their pocket of origin when incorrect is a form of adaptive spacing. The learning item is held at the same duration until it's successfully retrieved. Another application of adaptive spacing could be applied to practice sessions. In this practice schedule, folder sessions are delivered with 1-day intervals followed by a 3-day interval. This schedule may be appropriate to the needs of the majority of the class, but there could be some students who struggle with the longer interval. One option to reduce the difficulty for these students could involve parents supplementing practice through the addition of extra sessions at home. This would reduce the intervals between sessions and reduce the retrieval difficulty. When students are struggling, parents are offered the option to do 1 or more additional sessions at home. The original process included checking for understanding, and the strategy of elaborative interrogation builds on this. Elaboration is a form of retrieval and it can value add to the learning experience. Elaborative interrogation involves asking students how and why questions which facilitate the searching of their memory for related cognitive schema. When found, new links are created in a meaningful context that assists future recall of the learning material. Our working memory limits the rate and scope of knowledge acquisition. Novice learners in a particular subject area require explicit instruction and supportive information to manage this cognitive load. The use of explicit instruction is maintained in the revised process. Please add any thoughts or questions on the Criterion phase to your notes. I'd now like to move on to discussing the application of theory to the retention phase. So to recap, originally correct flashcards entered the test pocket during the week and were tested once a week. So they rested for between 1 and 7 days, depending on when they arrived into that pocket. At the mastery test, correct flashcards went to the mastered pocket and incorrect flashcards went back to the store pocket, where they later re-entered the tutor phase. The Rawson and Dunlosky study identified this amount of repetition as inefficient, and so the flashcards in the revised process returned to the pocket of origin when incorrect. Their study also identified that 3 broader space retrievals were efficient and effective for greater learning durability. Researchers have attempted to identify the optimal type of interstudy interval. Should those 3 spaced retrieval sessions in the retention phase be equally spaced, contracting, or expanding? Kang et al.'s laboratory study used an educationally relevant schedule of spaced retrieval opportunities. They assessed recall during learning as well as at a delayed test. Kang et al. And others observed that expanding intervals provide optimal learning gains at educationally relevant delays. In the absence of relevant studies related to children, further research is required. However, their results with adults showed that expanding intervals were best for learning retention. These results were applied to the process through a rearrangement of the folder pockets. Previously, the folder process had used only 8 pockets, but the folder had always had 4 spare pockets. There were 6 test pockets, which fit very well with Rawson and Dunlosky's results, suggesting 3 retrievals to reach a criterion of learning, followed by 3 broader spaced retrievals to enhance learning durability. The pockets, therefore, just required some rearranging. To incorporate expanding spaced retrieval, rest pockets were inserted between the test pockets. These are the shortest intervals. This is a longer interval. This is longer again. And this is the longest interval between retrievals. Rawson and Dunlosky, Kang et al. And Sepeda et al. And other researchers agree. The duration of spaced intervals relates to the desired retention period. The goal of education and the focus of the mastery learning folder process is long-term retention. Minimally, the learning from 1 year level should endure to provide a baseline of prior knowledge for the following year. So the next question became, how long should the intervals be between expanding retrieval sessions? Sepeda et al. Conducted an amazingly comprehensive investigation to assess how the timing of study events affect retention. They used 26 interstudy intervals, testing the resultant retention at 7, 35, 70, and 350 days later. So first, the participants learned a fact to the criterion of 1 successful retrieval. An interstudy interval was applied, followed by a retrieval session which included 2 successful retrievals with feedback. This was then followed by the delayed tests. This was their amazing results. An interval of 1 day between retrievals resulted in a correct recall at test day 7. Retrieval sessions with an interval duration of 11 facilitated correct recall at the 35-day delayed test. An interval of 21 days resulted in recall on test day 70 and also on test day 350. So the learning items were recalled almost a year later. These results had potentially major implications for the retention phase of the mastery learning folder process. The results at the shortest interval were used to review the criterion phase. As previously discussed, the specific intervals will vary depending on the classroom practice schedule, but they will be approximately 1 to 3 days apart. So an interval of 1 day demonstrated a retention of 7 days. So the intervals in the criterion phase should prepare the student for the memory demands of the next longer interval. These are the pockets related to the retention phase. You'll notice that the first 2 pockets are green, indicating that they're a part of the tutor testing stage, where spaced retrieval sessions occur over shorter intervals during the week. The intervals in the mastery test stage are weekly. The intervals I'm about to describe are created because the testing process works backwards through the pockets, but the content moves forward. Don't think too much about that. Just let me demonstrate. I'd like to focus on these two pockets to show how the spaced intervals are created in the process. The practice schedule is Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And at this session, these flashcards arrive into the rest pocket. By the next session on the Wednesday, the flashcards have been in the rest pocket for 2 days. The Wednesday folder session then proceeds from the start pocket. The flashcards in the rest pocket miss one session. They move into the next pocket as a bundle after the testing has been completed. There they continue to rest. Come Friday, those flashcards have rested for another 2 days, making a spaced interval of 4 days. They will then be tested at the Friday session. As intervals will vary somewhat according to the practice schedule, I describe this interval as roughly half a week. This was not an interval tested by Cepeda et al., but as larger intervals result in longer retention, the learning item should be retained for more than 7 days. This should prepare students for the memory demands of the next longer interval. Let's look at the next interval in isolation. Testing proceeds backwards as usual. Correct content moves forward. Once again, the flashcards in the rest pocket move forward as a bundle after testing has finished in the previous pocket and missing one session. The learning content in the mastery test stage is addressed on a weekly basis. Flashcards arrive in the rest pocket over the course of 1 week during the tutor testing. So the spaced interval of these learning items will range from 1 to 7 days. Once they've moved up to the next test pocket, they're not addressed again until 1 week later at the mastery test session. So the total spaced interval is between 7 and 14 days. This coincidentally works well with Cepeda et al.'s 11-day interval, which produced a retention duration of 35 days. This interval should prepare the students for effortful but successful retrievals at the forthcoming longest spaced interval. At the once-a-week mastery test, learning items that are correct move forward. Proceeding backwards, the flashcard bundle in the rest pocket moves forward. Moving backwards, the next bundle moves forward. Moving back again, the testing then continues. And the bundle in the rest pocket moves forward. The content in these pockets won't be addressed again until the next mastery test session. This means that the content in these pockets will rest for a week. So the learning items rest for 1 week in each pocket. This creates a total spaced interval of 21 days, which corresponds with a potential retention interval of 350 days. I'd like to advise again that my application of these results are based on theory, and Cepeda et al.'s study conducted on adult populations. I hope that this process and tool may be used for similar studies to investigate memory attributes in younger populations. To recap, when the spaced intervals are short during the criterion phase, the durability of the learning is short. As the duration of the intervals increase through the retention phase, the learning durability also increases. The mastery learning folder process seeks to manage desirable difficulty with the goal of effortful but successful retrievals over increasing intervals. This is a summary of the new process as it relates to spaced retrieval practice. Please let me know your thoughts or questions on the application of the spaced retrieval research. So far, I've discussed macro sequencing conditions, for example, the spacing of folder sessions and the spacing of retrievals. Investigations within cognitive psychology have also identified micro sequencing effects related to the arrangement and spacing of learning items within a practice session. Interleaved practice involves the shuffling or interspersing of learning items from different domains or categories, rather than blocking them by topic. There's different conditions in which blocking or interleaving produce learning advantage. As the mastery learning folder can be used for cross-curricular learning items, my research goal was to discover the ideal micro-spacing sequence for testing learning items within each pocket. This was a complex aspect of my research, and time here limits the detail that I can share. At the end of my presentation, I will provide a link to my thesis should you wish to follow the application decisions in more detail. Roa et al. Compared practice of the same type of practice questions with mixing, interleaving, the practice of maths questions from different categories, e.g. word problems, equations, and calculations. They found large learning gains at delayed tests because the interleaved maths questions provided practice in both identifying the problem type and matching it to a solution procedure. The opposite is true in many maths textbooks. When only problems of the same type are routinely practiced, the type of problem is implicitly provided, and so it's only the solution procedure that's practiced. When questions from different categories are mixed, the selection of a solution procedure is also practiced, reflecting the requirements of exams and real-life situations. These papers and others suggest that mixed mathematics flashcards would benefit from interleaving within the mastery learning folder process. As teachers add practice items to the tool, mixed cumulative mathematics practice will occur naturally. There's a lot less interleaving research on language-based topics. Carr-White and Goldstone suggest that blocking categories may assist students to determine similarities between language learning items. For example, if spelling word practice is blocked, students may notice spelling patterns. Likewise, young students may see generalizations when practicing the decoding of phonics words. The application to the folder process is to interleave mixed mathematics questions and block language practice by subject. This adjustment is easily translated into the folder process. The learning items will be randomly mixed when the tutor or teacher removes them from each pocket. They can then simply rearrange them in their hand according to subject areas. This will result in mixed mathematics practice across topics, but the blocking of language items. Please share your thoughts or questions on the applications of the interleaving research. I'd like to move on now to the last category of theory application, which is metacognitive modelling and development. Flavelle defined metacognition as an awareness or an analysis of our own thinking or learning processes. Dunlosky and Metcalf describe three facets: monitoring, reflecting on the state of one's thinking; knowledge, understanding one's thinking; and control, the ability to regulate our thinking. All aspects of metacognition are highly relevant to the Mastery Learning Folder process, particularly because it facilitates thinking challenges which sometimes end in incorrect answers, with the potential to emotionally challenge many students. More traditional practice and revision activities, such as rereading and highlighting, can create inaccurate judgments of learning. Students may equate the understanding of content with the belief that they will remember it. The use of desirable difficulties within the folder process enables students to monitor what they do and do not know. The process provides feedback that facilitates accurate judgments of learning. In this reality, teachers and tutors can assist students to develop more accurate beliefs about learning. They can model these beliefs through ongoing conversations about the learning process during folder sessions. For example, they can explain that desirable difficulty learning strategies are designed to cause forgetting and thinking struggle, which scientists have shown will help them to remember their flashcards at the next practice session. The folder process will give them plenty of opportunities to alter their beliefs about failure. The metacognitive goal is to inspire persistence and the ability to delay gratification. Teacher and tutor conversations over time can highlight students' progress and help them to develop metacognitive control to, as Hattie and Yates describe, welcome errors as opportunities to learn. This self-regulation and the visible nature of the learning progress within the tool can lead to self-efficacy and motivation. This was my experience with the process in the classroom. Do you have any thoughts or questions on student metacognition as related to the process? Now, to conclude the presentation, I'm going to step you through the revised Mastery Learning Folder process. I'm going to do one tutor testing session and one mastery testing session. Before I begin, please note that I won't be separating the flashcards from each pocket into their subject areas because it's too difficult with the animation, and I'm also using only a small number of flashcards. Also, the flashcards that I'm using are completely random. You wouldn't find the type of mathematics flashcards that I'm using in the same student's folder. Tutors will start from the start test pocket. However, if there's no content in that pocket, they will start from the pocket that has the content that is furthest along in the process. Right, let's begin. 18 divided by 3 was recalled by the student, and so because it's come out of the tutor testing stage, a new flashcard is transferred from the store into the first test pocket. So the flashcard was 18 divided by 3. Even though it was correct, I can still ask elaborative questions. So I might say, how did you remember that? Well, that flashcard wouldn't be in the folder unless the student had already mastered their times tables. So the student may say, well, I know 6 times 3 is 18, So 18 divided by 3 is 6. The next flashcard couldn't be remembered, and so I could ask, do you know which sounds don't follow the rules for this word? That remains aside. The next word is recognised and moves forward, and so another flashcard is transferred from the store pocket into the first test pocket. Now that the testing of this pocket is finished, the incorrect flashcard returns to the same pocket. Now I'm going to work backwards, hitting the rest pocket. Those flashcards move as a bundle without being tested forward to the next pocket. This leaves me an empty pocket ready for the testing in the next pocket. That regular subitizing amount was recognised by the student, so it moves forward. This word wasn't recognised, so I could ask which parts of the word can be sounded out. Now this pocket is empty, and so the flashcard that was not correct returns to the same pocket. Moving backwards, that 10 frame amount was recognised, it moves forward. And this flashcard required the student to find 2 addition and 2 subtraction sums. So I could scaffold this question and I could ask 7 take away what equals 4, and just go through with them and make sure they understand what is being asked. So that flashcard would return to the same pocket. Moving backwards to the next pocket, that spelling word was able to be written down correctly. So I could ask, that's a tricky word, how did you remember it? The next spelling word wasn't written down correctly, so I could maybe ask which parts of the word can be sounded out, and they would say the word follows the rules. That will stay aside until I've finished testing the pocket. This is a behavioural goal. It's I raised my hand to wait to be called in group situations. So I would ask the student, have you made any progress with this personal goal? And he or she may say no or sometimes. If they say sometimes and it's showing progress, I can see in the classroom, then that flashcard would move forward. That number was 241, and the student was required to say if it was odd or even, and they could answer correctly. The tutor could ask, what's another odd number in the hundreds, just to reinforce that they know and understand how to recognise odd numbers. We've got 1 flashcard left in that pocket, and that is a personal goal. Yesterday, I remembered to breathe slowly and deeply when I felt upset. So this flashcard is coming out of the very first test pocket. So the student may say, well, no, I haven't remembered to do that. And so we could talk about that. And both of those flashcards go back to the pocket that they've come from. So that's the end of the tutor testing session for that day. And now I'm going to go on to 1 session of mastery testing. So the mastery test begins at this pocket, but if there's not content, then the teacher will move backwards until they find the pocket that has the content that's furthest along. I'm beginning from this pocket, testing the first flashcard, which is a behavioural goal, personal goal. I took turns with others in partner or small group activities. So the student says, yes, I have been doing that. And so that now moves forward. This is a word that was also recognised. So it moves forward, and the odd or even number was not recognised, and so I could ask, should you be looking at the hundreds, tens or ones? and then that flashcard will return to the same pocket. Moving backwards, the bundle from the rest pocket moves forward, the bundle from the next rest pocket moves forward. This leaves the pocket empty, ready for the next testing pocket. 18 divided by 3 was remembered. The word was not recognised, so it is set aside and discussed. We could say you got this and the sounds, and then talk about how they might be able to remember that next time. And who is friends with 5 was recalled. That flashcard that wasn't correct returns to the same pocket, and the bundle in the rest pocket moves forward. So any thoughts or questions that are related to the overall revised process, please jot them down and I would love to respond to you. So here's my contact details, and if you're interested in looking further into my thesis, you can find it in Google Scholar. I'd just like to say thank you to all the sponsors who made this conference possible. Very much appreciated. Thank you for watching my presentation. Unfortunately, I don't get a lot of opportunities to discuss this research. So if you're interested, or if you're a researcher in one of the fields that I've been talking about, I would love to be able to hear your perspective, get your feedback, get some further advice about the process. So please feel free to get in touch, and thank you once again.